Welcome to Experiencing God's Stories at Cedar Crest, the podcast where we celebrate the incredible ways God is moving in and through the lives of His people. Here we share real stories of experiencing a real God, testimonies here to inspire, encourage, and remind us of His faithfulness. So whether you're driving, at home, or on the go, take a moment to hear how God is changing lives. We're so glad that you're here to experience these stories with us. Hey everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Experiencing God's Stories at Cedar Crest. We've got another story for you today. So why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself, because I know you as the global executive, administrative pastor. So just go ahead.
Well, thank you, Austin, for allowing me to come on and tell a little bit of my story today. So I am Lynn Wilson. I'm the administrative and discipleship pastor here at Cedar Crest. I've been a part of the staff for about 12 years now, been a member of the church for about 35, but on staff for the last 12 years, and just a privilege to come and share a little bit of my story today.
Yeah, that's awesome. So we started this podcast as a church almost 4 weeks ago, right? We've been collecting stories. We've heard a lot of how God has moved. What a lot of people don't get to see, I think we got a little taste of it from Miss Linda, is that there's also a legacy and a history of experiencing God here and what that looks like. So I'd love for you to talk about, number one, your story, because I'm pretty sure it has to do with stuff that's happened in the past. Yeah. But I'd love for you to walk us through, how did you experience God?
So experiencing God has been something that has been critically important in my life for a number of years. I was probably introduced to this resource, I would say back in the late 90s, maybe. It's been a long time ago. Went through the material at that time just as a participant, and it was just a radical transformation in the way I viewed things at that time. Have had the opportunity over the number of years to lead and facilitate Experiencing God groups, and even do weekends where we would go elsewhere and lead Experiencing God weekends. So it's become very much ingrained in who I am and how I view things in this world. And this is just one of the stories that I've recounted to people in various groups through the years that was just such a pivotal moment in my life for a number of reasons that I'll get into as we go through the story.
All right, let's rock and roll. Take us to the beginning, dude.
Yeah. So my journey with Christ started about 40 years ago. So it was not something that I was raised in church. That was not a part of my upbringing as a teenager or as a student. It was when I was in my early 20s that Christ introduced Himself to me. And I was attending a church at that particular time, and it just became really clear to me that I did not have a relationship with Christ, and was just confronted one day about the fact that if I died at that particular time, that I would go straight to hell. And it just shook me to my core. And it was very soon after that I made the decision to follow Christ. And down through those years in the church, I've served in just about any capacity over these 40 years that a person can serve as a follower of Christ. That's working on teams and committees and running building programs, search committees for staff people. So I had done just so many things in the church that you wonder, well, is there anything left that I haven't done? And that's an important aspect, because what happened in this particular story was that Cedar Crest had been looking for a place to serve overseas, that we could partner with an organization and reach a group of people that was unchurched, unreached people groups is what we would refer to them as. And so we were transitioning there, and we had sent a team overseas to Macedonia because our missions coordinator, missions pastor at that time, had just been exposed to a group of people called the Roma people in Europe. We would refer to them as gypsies. That's what they're commonly referred to as the gypsies of Europe. And they are literally a people without a country. They are spread out all over Europe, millions of them, but they don't have a country that they call theirs, home. And so there was some discussion about could we begin a work with the Roma people in Eastern Europe. We had a team go over for a vision trip that year, and they came back and said, we have found the highest concentration of Roma people anywhere in Europe, and that is in northwestern Bulgaria. And we really think that's where we need to begin a work with our Southern Baptist International missionaries that were there. As they're given that report of what they saw and where we might go, I clearly heard God speak to my spirit, to my mind, and he simply said 3 words: you must go. What was radical about that for me was that in this whole time period that I was serving in the church, attending church every time the doors open, doing whatever was asked of me, I had never been on a mission trip anywhere. I'd never been on a mission trip in the state. I had not been on a mission trip anywhere else in the States. I had not been on a mission trip, certainly in a cross-cultural, out-of-the-country kind of environment. I did not have a passport. And so it was just so bizarre to me as I began to think about it. Why do you think he spoke that to you? Because you've never had a desire to go anywhere. Never even given it a moment's thought. Even with all of the missions reports and mission trips that other people are going on, it never even crossed my mind that that was something that I was supposed to do. I had all these other things that I was involved in and felt gifted in, and it just never crossed my mind that that's what I was supposed to do. And I just clearly heard those 3 words: you must go. And then I had a decision to make. Did you just think that up on your own? Did God just speak to you and tell you that you need to do something that's way out of your comfort zone to go internationally? And as I began to think about that and pray through that, I just never got a release from it. That was a very specific command for me. And that's one of those principles of experiencing God, is that God doesn't give us suggestions. He gives us commands. He gives us directions, instructions. And so, again, I go back to another one of those things from experiencing God, and that is that no, Lord. Those 2 words can never be used in the same sentence, because if he clearly speaks to you and you say no, then he's not Lord. And if he is Lord and he speaks to you, your only answer can be yes. And so you just can't say. So as I began to wrestle with that and think about it more and more, and it clearly came to me that I didn't think this up on my own, because I've never had a thought about going out of the country, that this had to be something that God was speaking directly to me. And the next step for me was to get a passport. Number one, go to our missions pastor and say, I'm in. And then secondly, go get a passport so that I could go.
Yeah. Well, I got some questions for you, because you know I'm going to have some questions. So, just looking back that Sunday where you heard, you got to go. You ever felt something like that before? You ever felt God speak to you clearly before?
Yeah, and in a number of instances, the first one I clearly remember when So I was involved in a church, a town called Gina, an hour or so away from here. It's where my wife was from, and I was working. So my background is not doing church work, vocational
Yeah.
ministry. My background is in hospital laboratory and hospital administration. And so I was working at a hospital in Gina, attending a church in Gina, where church that I was saved. And not long after that, we were having. They used to have opportunities for Baptist men to kind of speak in the pulpit on a given Sunday of that particular year. And I clearly heard God speak to me that when I had the opportunity to share my story in church, that I needed to share that story, and I did, and it was something that I felt very comfortable doing at that time, which was really radical for me because inwardly I'm a shy introvert kind of person. That's why I chose the lab, because people usually in the lab are introverts because they're out of sight and out of
Yeah.
mind and just doing the stuff. And so at heart I'm an introvert, and so that was really a radical thing for me to do: get up in front of a congregation of people and begin to share my story. But it opened a door for me to do that. That led to me preaching in churches literally hundreds of times in that area and up here and other places around the world. And so that was probably the very first time, not that long after I made my profession of faith. I clearly heard him speak to me a couple of years later when I was being considered to serve as a deacon in that church, and followed that. And so this is just something that even before I was introduced to experiencing God, was a part of who I was, because it just kept happening to
Yeah.
me.
Yeah. So holding the extreme of leaving the country and speaking on a Sunday morning with your testimony, both of them are scary, right?
Yeah.
But in your mind, there seems to be just so much weight that was put on that you must go.
Yeah.
Why? Why do you think that one sticks out to you more than any of the other ones?
It was such a radically different thing for me to do, to be willing to go, first of all, and all that meant. It was also became so embedded in my mind, because after I went the first time, it just became a part of who I was at that point. I've been to Bulgaria probably 15 or 16 times since then. I have some dear friends there. I've been all over the country and spoken at churches and conventions and seminars. And so it's just become such an incredibly important part of my life. I spent probably 3 or 4 years really trying to learn the language so that I could speak to them when I was there. I just felt like if I was going to continue to go as often as I was going, that I needed to be able to communicate with them. Now I can't speak
Dang.
like you and I are speaking now, but I was able to. I just say often I was able to speak enough to get us in trouble and out of trouble while I was there. And so, but if we went into a store or something along those lines, then I could communicate with the clerk that was there as what we wanted and how many and those kind of things. So it's just something that I immersed myself in for a number of years. And this was, again, before I came on staff here at the church. And so it just became a part of my life, and it all started on that particular Sunday because I had no idea what God was going to do. I couldn't see into the future and know what that was going to lead to, because ultimately what it led to was a conversation that I had with Greg on a plane coming back from Bulgaria in 2012, that the decision was made that I was going to leave my vocational career and come on staff at Cedar Crest as the administrative pastor. So that decision is so ingrained and so burned in my mind, because years later, it was directly involved in making a decision to leave a vocation that I loved, that I had done for 30 plus years, being the catalyst for me leaving that vocation and totally starting a new chapter of my life.
Wow. That's pretty big, dude.
Yeah, it was a pretty monumental event.
Yeah.
If you look back. But of course, for me, I had no way of knowing that when he first said, "You must go." Couldn't have foreseen that, because at that time, being on a church staff was nowhere on my radar. I was fully committed to doing what I did. Felt called to that. Felt that I was useful in that role in the hospitals, and being a person of faith in that kind of an environment. So it was not anywhere on my radar screen, but it was on God's radar screen all along. He was just trying to take me from where I was to where he wanted me to be, and this was one of the steps that he used to do that.
That's awesome, because I think it brings up a big tension point for a lot of people, and it's the tension between, okay, God speaks, I have a crisis of faith where I need to follow through, and the fruit of it. And that in between, right? That's where a lot of people get discouraged, or they bail out, or they get confused, or they get concerned. So without being able to see into the future, right, all those things, for people who are wrestling with that right now, like, hey, God has told me to do something, but I don't know the fruit of that.
Yeah.
How would you encourage them?
Very easily, I would say, when you hear that command, when you hear God speak to you, you just take the next right step of obedience. Don't try to figure out what that's going to look like a month from now, a year from now, 10 years from now, because I certainly didn't. I just heard him say, go, and I said, yes, I'm going to go. And so always the first step is the hardest, right? Just about anything that we do, the first step is always the hardest. So you just simply take the step. Not the what ifs, because that's what everybody wants to do. Well, what if this happens? What if that happens? What if? No, not the what ifs. Just take the next right step of obedience, as small and as simple as that is, and then watch to see what happens, and then take the next right step, and you see where it goes, because God's in control of those things. So that's the biggest thing. Just take the first right step towards that obedience.
Yeah. It's crazy to think about that choice or decision to follow.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, it's a choice. It is a choice.
Yeah. That decision to follow, when he said, you must go, and we talk about experiencing God a whole lot. That was one of the first things that Cedar Crest did in Bulgaria, right? Is we helped translate experiencing God, the actual resource, so that they could use it.
Yeah. It was, and that was a really critical time for us there as well, just trying to instill in them those principles of hearing God speak, because as most all of the listeners and watchers know, Eastern Europe was under communist rule for more than 40 years, and they weren't allowed to freely speak, or if they freely thought or freely spoke, it could land them in prison. Yeah. And so they were used to people speaking to them and telling them what they were going to do and what they might believe. And so even this idea of hearing God and moving upon what they heard was really a new concept for them. And so it was so incredibly important to us we reached out to Lifeway to get the publishing rights to the Experiencing God book, and we were able to do that. And we were able to get the Experiencing God book translated into Bulgarian. And then we asked Richard and Tom Blackaby, two of Henry Blackaby's sons, to travel with us to Bulgaria to actually lead a nationwide seminar
Wow.
on the Experiencing God material. And so that was really a special time for us, being able to introduce literally a whole country to the Experiencing God material.
Wow. I'm pretty sure we have one of those framed
We do.
in the worship center.
We do. We do. We do.
Well, that's incredible. So here's a plug for missions, okay?
Yeah.
If somebody's heard or felt the Lord lead them to take that step, to be involved in missions, and their laundry list of excuses, reasons why not, is similar to yours. Outside of that, hey, just take the first right step. Mm-hmm. What would you say to them?
Think about it and pray about it a lot, and then take that next right step and understand that wherever you are, God knows exactly where you are, and He knows exactly what you need. So I'll go back to an Experiencing God story from Henry Blackaby. He left a good, vibrant, growing church in California and was called to a little small church, Faith Baptist Church, I think was the name of it, in Saskatoon, Canada. And there were 10 members there. And all of his friends and all of the people around him said, Henry, don't do it, because you're going to get up there and you're going to get lost and no one is ever going to hear from you again. And his response was, I can't be lost if I'm going and being obedient to what God has called me to do. And ultimately, he didn't get lost. Ultimately, he wrote the Experiencing God material out of his experience with God in that small church in Saskatoon. And now, for a generation, multiple generations of people, Henry Blackaby is known all over the world for what he did and the material that he and Claude King put together and published. So he certainly didn't get lost. He was very much found because of his obedience. And so I would say to anybody who's wrestling with that idea is, it's not that I'm going to always be away and I'm going to have to raise a family in another culture. What happens if I get sick? What happens when, maybe you're a younger person and you say, well, my parents are getting older? We just ask all of those questions, and those are just the wrong questions. Again, one of those Experiencing God moments is that in order to get the right answer, you have to ask the right question. And the right question is not what is God's will for my life, because that puts the emphasis on us.
Yeah.
The right question is, what is God's will? And once I resolve what the answer to that is, then I have to have that decision. I have to have that crisis of belief as to whether or not I'm going to follow Him. So as a missionary, it's not about what's going to happen years down the road. Am I ever going to be able to come back to the States? Am I going to have to live my whole life somewhere else? That's just the wrong question. It's, what am I going to be? Am I going to be obedient to God's will for my life right now? And I'm going to leave the future to Him, because that's the very best hands our future can be in.
That's good. That's really good. Look at you. He's profound wisdom. And there's no cup of coffee.
Well, I've had plenty of that today already. Everybody knows that I don't do well until I've had my second or third cup of coffee in the morning. So that's why we're taping this in the afternoon.
That's right. That's right. Well, dude, I'm glad we got to sit down. Glad we got to hear your story. I'm glad you've got some wisdom that I know people my age haven't heard yet. So thank you, number
Yeah,
one.
and that's one of the reasons why we actually started doing the Experiencing God at Cedar Crest right now, was because as we began to ask people about it, there was a generational gap between even an exposure to the material, and we really wanted the younger generation of Cedar Crest to be exposed to that resource, because it is truly a different way of looking at life and decisions that we make, and we just felt like that your generation of folks needed to be exposed to that resource.
Yeah, you're right on. Yeah. Sweet.
Appreciate the opportunity to come and share with you today.
I'm glad you're here. Hey, everybody, we're glad you tuned in. We can't wait to see you back for the next episode.